The so-called Frog Lady is my favorite character in The Mandalorian, and I showed this figure off as well as a figure of her husband in a recent collection pickups video. These are vintage style custom figures made by Has No Talent. He even included some accessories like the egg canister that the Frog Lady carries around with her. Now, around the time that I got these, Desert Octopus also released his take on the characters in the form of some 3D models that you can download and print, so I wanted to take a look at them today. As with all of Desert Octopus's models, these are for sale on Cults.com, and I thought I wanted to try and use this as an opportunity to try out some new resins that I had been sent from the maker Resione or Resi1. I'm not really sure how you're supposed to pronounce their name. They contacted me a while back and asked if I was interested in trying out some of their resins, and they actually have some interesting specialty resins that I've never tried before, so I said yes. And I chose this F80 flexible resin and their G217 transparent non-yellowing resin. I've had trouble with my clear prints yellowing after they're cured, so I thought I'd give that a shot as well. Talk about the transparent resin in a minute, but here is the F80 flexible resin, and it's unlike any resin that I've used up until now. It's very viscous and thick, as you can see when I pour it in the machine here. It's gum colored, and they don't mean chewing gum, they mean like your teeth and gums, because this is often used for dental applications from what I understand. Now, I tried using the settings that they have on their website, but I was unable to get anything that used support material to print properly. However, I did have success with things that were printed directly on the print bed without using any kind of supports. So here I have my Jabba Idol model that I often use for testing printers. And I also used the Agua model from the Craftsman on the Steady Crafting channel here on YouTube. That came out really well. I imagine if I fine-tuned my settings well enough, I could get it to print even with things that require support material, but I ran out of the flexible resin before I could actually do that. However, I had enough to print one of the parts for this figure that we're making today, and I'll show you that in just a minute. Most of the action figures themselves I printed in ABS-like resin from Elegoo on the Elegoo Saturn, and they came out just fine. I've done this a number of times on the channel, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but you can see all the parts are here. After curing the parts, I assembled them in the same way that I've done a number of times on the channel, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that, but they did go together relatively easily without requiring a lot of sanding or anything like that. So in that sense, these are pretty much exactly the same as the other Desert Octopus figures that I've made on the channel, with the exception of the egg canister model, which I decided to print in the Resione resins. Now, as you can see, this actually did yellow quite a bit, but I was able to fix this by reprinting it with lower curing times, and also by curing it after printing less, so it worked out okay. This is the flexible part that I printed here. It's supposed to glue onto the back. And it's very flexible, actually. It's really quite remarkable. It feels like rubber. And I think this will work really well for this part, because if you printed this in the regular ABS-like resin, you could probably get it to work, but it would not be at all easy to put on and take off like a real accessory would. And you can see here, I'm able to just sort of bend it over her arms here, and it fits just fine. So for those of you keeping score, that was 3 resins, and here's the 4th one. This was the Elegoo water washable resin that I used simply because it was available to me, and also it had the right color, more or less, for the eggs that I wanted to print. So I printed more eggs than I thought I would need, because I'm always losing these. As you can tell, they tend to fly off in all directions. The idea here was that I was going to use something printed in the right base color and then accent it with some paint. So I'm just applying a little bit of reddish brown paint to each of these just to give them a little bit of a mottled color. You're barely going to be able to see this once they're actually in the egg container, but I think it will make a bit of a difference. Here's the egg container that I reprinted and then also sprayed with a gloss coat spray to make it as transparent as possible, and I think that turned out really well, actually. This is surprisingly good effect. So I think this resin, actually, when used properly, is pretty good. My plan for this was to fill the container with a 5th kind of resin, which is the only non-3D printing kind of resin I'm using here. It's a clear polyester casting resin. And this you mix together with an activator, and over time it will cure and become just a very clear solid. And I was thinking that this would take the place of the liquid in the container. The liquid in the actual container appears to be a light blue, so I used some resin dye to just tint it a light blue. Then I added the catalyst so that it would start the curing process. And then I used a funnel to pour the resin into the container. I wanted it to look like the eggs were floating in this liquid, but when I tried it earlier, they would always go straight to the bottom. So I printed some eggs in clear, in the same material that the egg container is made out of, and I put them in first so that they would support the colored eggs and allow them to look like they were floating. So I got them in there. Here's the container after it was cured, and you can see the eggs do look like they're floating. The top does technically open on a hinge, but I glued it shut because it was not particularly robust, and I figured it would eventually break. So you see they have here a lot of metal parts that are molded into the egg container, and the idea is that I'm going to be painting those a silver color to make it look like metal, and then sort of glass underneath that. Once that was done, I took the strap section there that I painted separately and glued it onto the back of the container with some super glue. At this point, I decided to use a black wash to accentuate some of the shadows and details on here because I wasn't quite satisfied with how it looked. But after that, I was done with this piece. But of course, I still had to do the figures themselves. I'm not going to show the full process for this because it's not really the focus of this video, but I did want to show that I had used the airbrush to do the skin tones because I wanted some nice gradations in color that can sometimes be difficult to do with a regular brush. I've been watching a lot of videos about how to use an airbrush to paint miniatures and things, and they use it very, very sort of subtly in many cases, just to apply very, very small amounts of paint at once, and that's what I was doing here, just to make the sort of nose and mouth area be brighter than the rest of the head, and then also have some bright spots on the rest of the head as well, like around the ears and things like that. So in just a moment, we're going to jump to the end and see the finished figure, but before that, I wanted to talk to you about today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes on a wide variety of topics, including art, design, and photography. There are no ads, and they're launching new premium classes all the time, so you're sure to find something that interests you. And it's less than $10 a month with an annual subscription. Most recently, I took the class Resin and Alcohol Ink Art Basics by Debbie Coles. She shows how you can add alcohol inks to clear resin to make some amazing looking designs, and while I don't really have any interest in making coasters myself, it got me thinking about how I might be able to use this kind of resin in other projects. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a free trial of premium membership so you can explore your creativity. And here we have the finished figure. The overall paint job is relatively simple, although I added more detail than I typically would for a vintage style figure like this, since I already had the ones from Has No Talent. I thought I'd put a little more detail on here. I thought the skin came out well with the airbrushing. I thought the egg canister turned out particularly well, and pretty much exactly the way I had envisioned it, which is always nice. We have the straps here, which bend nicely to allow her to put it on without too much trouble, and I do like that you can display her with the egg canister on her back like this, which is how we saw her several times in The Mandalorian. So yeah, I'm happy with this figure. I thought the eggs looked pretty cool here floating in the resin. Of course, we can't forget the Frog Lady's husband, who I also painted up, so let's bring him out right now. Again, I used the airbrush to do his face and also his hands, so you can see some nice gradations there, and I'm pretty happy with that part of the paint job. So that's about it for today's video. I just thought you might be interested in seeing how I put some of these resins to use. This video was brought to you by Skillshare and also my patrons, including these Palace VIPs. Check out the links in the video description for information about how you can get a free trial for Skillshare and sign up for my Patreon to support me for as little as $1 a month. Thanks very much for watching.